So good afternoon. I'm Tony Dubiel. I work for Red Hat. I'm out of Raleigh, North Carolina, and I focus primarily on network automation using Ansible. And today we're going to cover Cisco ISE and Cisco Catalyst Center. So this will be more of like an intro of, really getting started with using both of those platforms and creating workflows to, leverage automation against them. And over time, we might readdress the same solution set and then go a little bit deeper. So I'd like to start kind of more with the intro types of things and also a little bit more background of how to get started with using the collections of modules against these devices and a little bit of the backstory of what's going on behind the scenes with the modules themselves, and make sure everyone's comfortable with getting set up. And then we'll go into some use cases. And typically when I'm using this type of solution, whether it be like a controller or like a policy engine like ISE is, I normally use the DevNet sandbox. So that's what I'm using today. Unfortunately, the Catalyst Center, I noticed they took offline last night, or it might have been like the day before. But I was able to get in there and run my automation before they took it down. So sometimes they take it down either to do some type of maintenance, or they might be using it for like a boot camp or something like that. So I do have the automation that I ran previously. So we'll be able to go through and look at my workflows and kind of replay them, if you will, which is one of the capabilities of Ansible, is that you can go back and it creates artifacts of every job that you're running. So it's really easy to go through and analyze previous automation and to be able to replay it again if you want to run it again, using the same variables and stuff like that. So we'll get more into that when we get into the second half. So for now, it's more of a level set. So what I wanted to do, and again, these slides will be made available to you on the Meetup site, and also I'll have links in the remarks and description, under the YouTube video replay. So don't worry about these links right now, but I added links to all of the various things that I'm going to reference as we go through the slides. So the first thing I wanted to talk about was the Cisco ISE collection. So typically, when you hear collections mentioned with Ansible, you could be using them in two different ways. You could either be using them with Ansible Core Engine, which is the open source tool, and you have access to these collections of modules on Galaxy. So that's where these links will take you. There's also links internally to Red Hat to our console. And on the Automation Hub is where customers go to access similar content. Although it does give them support, but for the most part, the modules themselves are typically the same. The versioning might be a little bit different because it takes a little bit time to go through the rigor of becoming certified and all that kind of stuff. But because some of you may not be customers, I'm using the public links so that you'll have access to them directly. Now, the Cisco ISE is a collection for ISE, and it's built using the Python SDK. So that's what's under the hood. There's Python scripting running from the SDK. And then the modules are a wrapper on top of that. So that way you can parameterize your configurations, but you can implement them and render a configuration by using Ansible. So we're not going to get too deep into the underpinnings of how Python's working and things like that, but just know that the collection of modules is typically Python code. Now, some folks become confused because there's so many different types of Python code that's being used as part of these collections. So I wanted to kind of unpack that a bit too, in case there's some confusion. So really, when you first go to the documentation, so this again is a screenshot from Galaxy. And if I click on this link, it will take me into Galaxy, and I'll do that here in a few minutes. But on this slide, it's like the landing site in Galaxy for this collection of modules for ISE. And you can see that it has different tabs. The one that I typically go to first is the contents. And then that tells me the different categories of content that's available in this collection and the different types of modules. So one of the things that you'll notice here is that if collectively there's 685 different pieces of content that have been, collected in a collection and made available for you to use in Ansible. Now, when we start to unpack that, you'll notice that there's action and there's also module, and they have the same number. That's not always the case. And on the next slide, I'm going to differentiate what an action module is versus just a module. And then there's other code known as plugins. So sometimes you'll see, a plugin folder that is a part of a collection that may have different types of plugins. So some plugins that you may be familiar with are like lookup plugins, inventory plugins, and then a module, either a module, which is kind of confusing, or an action module. Those also have Python code. So other things that are also packaged in a collection, and it's not always the case across every collection, is you may have roles. Roles are playbooks that are meant to be shareable, and typically they're variabilized, so that way you separate, the code. The playbook becomes a role. The role has a folder structure. They'll be divided, into different categories. So things like templates and files and variables and tasks. So really, what typically you would have ran in a playbook, you'll run in a task and a role, and that gives you. I'm only seeing slide number 3. Is it the same for everybody? Yeah, we should be just on slide 3. That's correct. Yeah. So I don't know if maybe you can't see my mouse. Let me do this little. What do we got here? A pen. All right. So yeah. So right here, the roles part right here. Yeah. So there's a couple of roles. There's action and modules. So we'll talk about those in the next slide. And then there's a bunch of playbooks. So what this is these playbooks are also found in the documentation, and those are example playbooks. So normally when you go into a module, into the documentation, so there's like over here, you see there's a documentation tab. Then there's examples that are part of that documentation, and you can copy and paste those tasks out and use them in your playbooks. But what some vendors do, and what they did in this case, is they provide those playbooks in the repo along with all the other code. So you have all those example playbooks that you can use that's available from this collection of modules. So again, this is just high level. This is what's in the Cisco ISE module itself. When I click into here, I don't think it's going to show because I need to share my entire window. So let me do that real quick. Just bear with me a second. I should have just did it that way. Window. Is that the right one? No, it's this one, I think. Yeah, here we go. All right, so you should be seeing that crazy endless screen. But what I want to go back to is here, right? And blah, 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 picture in picture. Yeah. All right, get rid of this thing. All right, so I'm going to click into here. This takes us to Galaxy, and these are the contents. And then it's all listed out here with links to each type of content. And then if you wanted to just go to action modules, you can click in there, or just the regular modules, and you can click in there. And here's the playbook doesn't really show you anything in here. To see those, you would go to the actual repo. So see this repo link, right? So this is the GitHub repository for this collection of modules for Cisco ISE. And if you go into playbooks, all the different example playbooks are in here. So some of the things that we're doing today are similar to some of these examples. Not exactly the same thing. I kind of, made them a little bit different. But like if you go into these, you'll see like here's a backup create for ISE itself, right? So here is the example playbook, and you can see that it's calling different modules in the ISE collection. So here's a repository module, here's a backup config module, task info, right? So this is just, an out of the box type of example that you can use. And many other collections do the same thing. So there's always, something to get you started. All right, so going back to here, And what I wanted to do is just make sure everyone's clear on these different modules. So in the network space, I'm either dealing with a network device directly, right? So something like a router, switch, firewall. And I may be dealing with like an SDN controller, which today, like Catalyst Center and ICE is sort of in that category because we're using a REST API to interact, but we're not using REST APIs directly. We're using these collections of modules. So what most folks don't see behind the scenes is that there's really a pairing of modules to complete most of what you see when you go to the documentation of a module. It gives you parameters, but some of the parameters are being implemented locally on what we would call previously the controller. But today, because of the way that Ansible Navigator works and the way that the Ansible automation platform works, is you're working in what we call an execution environment. So in that execution environment, that is what would have been the controller in the past, but that's really like where you're originating running these playbooks from. So some modules, and this is an example of Cisco IOS, the backup module. So folks that have been doing network automation for a while are, probably familiar, or it may even be like one of the first playbooks that you built was a playbook to back up your configuration files. And this parameter backup, yes, enables the backup feature in the iOS config module. But the iOS config module is really two parts to it. So in that module, the action plugin for the module is everything that's happening locally. So that's why I mentioned execution environments are typically like where you're working locally. So if I back up a router configuration, by default, it's backed up to the execution environment. So that's a part of an action plugin because it's being coordinated to run locally, right? And then the other side of it is the module, right? So it's kind of the second side of this. So the module is really what we're doing in terms of in the playbook, based off of whatever the network logic is, we're applying some type of configuration, like rendering CLI commands to the device. And those parameters are a part of, the actual, module plugin part of the module, right? So those would be things like even within the config module for iOS, you have the backup parameter that's run as an action plugin. And then the module plugin, the logic could be implemented through lines. It could be the SRC, the source where you call a Jinja 2 template. And then within, various parameters, it's how you're, taking data, that structured data configuration that you're building, and then how it's being, invoked and then rendered to that remote network device. So module would be everything that's happening to the remote device. This confused me a bit because the action plugin is kind of the same, even if we're talking about like things outside of the network, like servers. You have like the local, parameters that you may be running, like something like a copy or something like that. But then you're connecting to like a remote server. So on that side of it, you're not connecting with a REST API or SSH and then sending serialized data. You're actually interacting with Python, and that Ansible is being executed remotely. So a server is a little bit different than a network device, which is why like when you automate servers, you have to have, there's requirements around versions of Python that you're running, and you're implementing, like when you're, updating a patch or restarting a service, all that's happening remotely. And it's being, it's leveraging the resources on that remote server, but that's a part of the module part of it. So action's always local, module is remote. It's just the remote is a little bit different how it's applied, depending on if we're talking about, network devices versus servers and things like that. Now, the third one here that's kind of lost under the hood are the connection plugins. So these are all about transport and how Ansible is managing the SSH session for you. And this is why we have to define our variables up front. So in our group variables, typically that's a good location, like in the inventory group bars for a particular group. If they're all connecting the same way, then Ansible connection could be network CLI. right? Or it could be other types too, like netconf. It could be a local connection if we're using REST APIs, or it could be HTTP API. So there's various connection plugins that we use, but those plugins are different than the vendor modules, right? But they're like dependencies. So we have to have those available for our execution environments as well. So I just say that because people see like the contents and there's all these different, plugins and modules, and that those are the three main ones really that you need to understand. Now, here's a real brief overview of what we're looking at with Cisco ISE. So keep in mind that there's all sorts of use cases that Cisco ISE provides you. A lot of it is around, authentication and authorization. Like think of things like Radius and TACAX that's authenticating devices, or like 802.1x, those types of, authentication of the device, but also there's the user and location aspects. So there's a lot of data that's collected in Cisco ISE, and that data is very valuable in the sense that we may need to determine a configuration state and validate that from ISE as a source of truth. And as configurations are changing as part of like a zero trust network access type of policy, um, you know, NAC type of policy, then we may need to update like a CMDB configuration or something along those lines. And Ansible lends itself to providing orchestration to be able to, extract specific data and make that data available for other systems. So I mentioned like this is kind of like an intro. So where I'm focused on today is primarily around what I can do in the DevNet sandbox, which is typically read-only types of things. Because the always on sandboxes, they don't give you like an admin account or privilege level where you can actually, build things. So they have some data already in the ICE. So they created some policies, and there's some fictional information in there for users and stuff like that, but it gives us access to it, and it's a good start, because if we're gleaning information, there's always the ability to use that for doing comparisons or checks against data to validate something, right? So what they do have is some device information, some user information, some endpoint information, and it all starts at the group level. So obviously we need to work with the groups, and then we drill into the group, to the elements that we want access to, or information for like a specific device or specific user, or specific endpoint. So in our workflow, we kind of follow that same path that we would typically follow through the GUI. So most of what I'm doing today is an alternative to using the GUI to access this information, by using the collection of modules directly in a workflow in Ansible to gather that data. And then that data can be made available as structured data to use for things like reports, or to update a ticket, or to send information to a particular incident response team. Since ICE has good visibility into security, who's accessing, where they're going. The more advanced features like security group tags and TrustSec. So all of that information is available to us if we have an account that has privileges to access this data. So the first thing, again, I mentioned is you really need to start at the group level to get that group output. And the reason why that is important is because of IDs. So that's how we map, these specific entities in the ICE have IDs. So for us to work with it programmatically, we always need to start from the reference of the group ID and then like work our way down, which is similar to like if you've done a lot of AWS automation, there's IDs for all those constructs. We typically need the state of what the IDs are, and then we can start modifying those elements and changing them and things like that. So one thing I want to do too, since I have the tabs you should be able to see, is I just wanted to go into this module and then give you like a real quick walkthrough of what's going on here. So this is the Cisco ISE collection, but this is the documentation. And what you can see here is all, regardless the vendor and the type of device or whatever it is, Ansible has documentation requirements that dictate that they must provide documentation that includes like all the available parameters. And then I also mentioned and showed you like some of those example playbooks. They're a part of the documentation as well. And you should see different response codes that come back so you can understand, output that you receive from running these modules. So when you invoke one of these modules, you're reading in parameters. So the parameter is on the left here. So think of a parameter as all those same, items that are configurable that you have access to from the GUI. So as you work your way down, you'll notice that we kind of reach a point where these are the parameters, and then there's some examples. In this case, there's one example of how would you use some of those parameters in a task that calls that module, right? So this is the identity group info, because we want the group information, and primarily we want the names of the groups, but we also want those IDs. So that way we can use those later directly in our workflows, and those become artifacts. So it's Cisco because it's the vendor. This is just a fully qualified collection name, or what we call a namespace. And it's Cisco, and then it's ICE, and then we have this identity group of info. Now, these here, hostname, username, password, all of this is covered in a credential. Like normally you would never hard code any of this stuff or make it available in your project or your repos, right? You would create a credential for these. And then every time that you're running the playbook, then it's authenticated using the encrypted credentials that are stored either directly in the automation platform or in an Ansible vault in a file, or it could be like a HashiCorp vault or CyberArk, a third-party system, but you're never, unless it's like a lab, but you're, best practice, and also from a security perspective, you're never going to have that exposed. And then these are return values that come back, because you're either expecting like a dictionary or a string or a list, and it just tells you here, the format of what should come back in those responses. So this is the documentation, right? So we'll see again in the playbook, you'll see how I constructed the playbooks together. But what I want to do now is continue to get through the slides before we get into the playbooks and stuff, which will be a part of the demo. So here's just an example output. You'll see more output later. This was just a user group for users. This is the default employee user group, and it has this specific ID and it has this name, employee. Now for devices, so that was a group for users. For devices, we can also go to the device groups if they're organized that way. And then from that, we can drill into the devices, and we can extract the device information, which is normally like, it'll give you the basic information, kind of like show ver from the devices. And it also provides you with the ID, the specific ID for that device and its name. So you can see what came back here is this is a CSR 1000V, which is like an older Cisco virtual router. And it pulled in, basic information. But what's important to us is, see, there's a profile name under Cisco, and then Cisco has various different models, right? So we would see this from device groups, but this is kind of like more of like a double click into the devices themselves. And for the parameters that we can set for a device, we can look at that real quick from the documentation. But keep in mind, there's also a group one above this, but I just went directly into the device list itself for info. So here's all the various parameters. We do have filtering capabilities, so that way you're not pulling in like all of the information. And what this is very similar to, these info modules, you'll notice there's a bunch of different info modules. It's very similar to facts. So like from an iOS perspective, there's iOS facts, and then you can do filtering from that as well, right? Because you can do subsets of what you want to look at, so you don't have to pull like all of the facts back. And what the facts are is really just taking the device configuration, and then your leveraging the structured data from that to populate a configuration that you can call directly from those facts. So same thing here is they're info modules, but that's what it's doing is it's pulling in the configuration. And then we have various parameters, and you can sort information and things like that. It's kind of like different querying and stuff that you can do like with other like web page REST API types of systems. So it's just the ISE's version of that. So here is an example, right? So and then here's return values and what we expect to come back. The response is supposed to be a dictionary or a list, right? So it's just the data format, right? So that one we'll see a version of this too as we get into the actual demo. So let me get back to here. And then the last part is the endpoints. So this is back to the group part. And then just like that, I kind of skipped around, like went group and then went right to a direct info from a device. This one here is the example of the group. But then if you click further into endpoint, then within these groups, there's going to be specific endpoints. But these groups here are based off of policy that states, if an endpoint has issues, right, it could go into a block list. So that's what this group is, kind of like the quarantine type of list. And then they have profiled endpoints that are successful, that have a good, posture that is in compliance. And then you've got these guest endpoints. So just like your Wi-Fi guest and switched guests that are like on a special VLAN, then those are a part of this group. So again, you'll see this in the workflow. So that's kind of like the gist of what we're going to look at from ISE today. Again, there's tons and tons of modules, right? There's great coverage for that. So just again, to kind of show you, there's 236 different action and module plugins, right? So that covers quite a bit of what you can configure from the GUI. So in terms of parity, there's good parity between these the coverage, right, of these modules and how you configure the GUI. And most of it is because it's just a wrapper on top of the Python SDK, and Cisco's done a good job of parameterizing all of what you can do in the GUI and making that available in the SDK, and henceforth the Ansible collection of modules. And all these modules or the SDK as well, is just really just defining parameters, right? So we do that in a playbook, right? And then the playbook runs those various modules on the back end, and then you're rendering a configuration, on the Cisco ISE. So now, like, switch gears to Catalyst Center. I'm not going to cover like all the exact same stuff, because we already saw basically what these modules look like. But I do want to make sure that I address a different confusion. So I wanted to make sure you know what actions modules are, or action plugins for the module versus the module with the the built-in logic that's implemented remotely on the target device. With Catalyst Center, that still exists as well, but there is additional confusion because there's two different collections. There's the Cisco.Catalyst Center, and there's the Cisco.DNAC, which was the DNA Center. So this one here, on the next slide, I'll walk through why they're both there. But basically, Cisco rebranded the DNA Center to Catalyst Center. So they changed the GUI. So some of the naming, like the logo, and then the naming, and then over time, some of the features will only be available on Catalyst Center versions that have that code base. And DNA Center eventually will be more of like a maintenance mode. But currently, it's you have both of those versions are available, and you can henceforth use either one of these collections depending on how old or what version your Catalyst Center is. So if you have a newer Catalyst Center that has the Catalyst Center logo, you can still use the DNA Center collection in Ansible. But if you have like an older DNA Center version running on your platform, then you can't you can't just go to the Catalyst Center. You'll have problems with that. So they backport DNA Center stuff. So the reason why I bring that up is the sandbox, the always on sandbox has an older version, or it did, unless that's why they took it down, because I wasn't able to access it yesterday and today. It was an older version, so I had to still use the Cisco.DNA Center collection in Ansible. But the reserved Catalyst Center, which is very popular because I could never seem to get a reservation because they only have so many pods available. But that one had a newer version, so you would use the Catalyst Center collection. So the next slide kind of explains that in a little more detail. But just to kind of call out here too, this time you'll notice that the action plugins for these modules is a different number than the module logic plugin, right? So there's more of them than there are action plugins. So it's not always the exact same. So what this would mean is that there's some of these modules are only for the controller. So it's the remote only part of the code. There's nothing happening locally on the controller in the execution environment. So that's why there's more of those. So it's not always the exact same number. And then there's other types of plugins and things too. And you'll notice there are some playbook examples here as well. And it's not the same numbers, right, from when you look at the DNA Center versus the Catalyst Center. So it's kind of strange because there was more content in the DNA Center because it's changed over time, APIs, the SDK and all that. So I think that's why. And the same thing, there's a different number of action modules versus the logic plugins. Or I keep saying the action modules, the action plugins for the module versus the logic plugins for the modules. Maybe I'll get this straight after saying it a few more times. Now, when and which one to use. So I ran into this, so I wanted to document this for others. So the whole deal with this is if you're starting a new project and you have a brand new appliance, then you're going to want to use the Catalyst Center, right? So even though they're supporting both currently, and there's no date to say when they're going to deprecate, but eventually it will, the DNA Center namespace in that collection will be deprecated. So it makes more sense to just go in with Greenfield with the Catalyst Center if you're using Ansible. For the DNA Center, it's really up to you depending on where you are with your playbooks. If you have a lot of playbooks that you've already created, then you have to go through and refactor them because these modules, it's a different collection and some of the module names are different. And there's different modules, right? That's why all the numbers weren't the same. So more than likely, if you were already running a lot of playbooks, you're probably gonna have to, you will have to refactor those, and you'll have to figure out where some of those deltas are in your code. So because of that, you can keep going forward for an unknown period of time and leveraging them. But at some point, the way that Cisco will start to implement the deprecation is they'll stop adding new features, right? So that's where you'll start to want to do that migration. If you've been using the DNA Center collection for a long time, then you can keep doing that. But at some point, when they go into more of a maintenance mode of it, you're not going to get any of the new features. So that would mean you would want to start, at a minimum, migrating your playbooks to the Catalyst Center collection when you're accessing those new features, and then incrementally, moving your playbooks over for some of the older stuff as well. But don't worry, if you're using it right now, there's no date or anything that would require you to rewrite your playbooks.